DevilNeverCry.
At one point in time, Capcom had planned to bring the Devil May Cry series to Sony's PlayStation Portable, going so far as to announce the title as under development. Yet more than a decade on, this title is nowhere to be found. What exactly was this so-called Devil May Cry Dance of SPARDA? And more importantly, what happened to it? I'll be putting all of my amateur sleuthing skills to the test in this video by attempting to drudge up as much official information as I can on this game. And hopefully, by the end of it, we'll all be well informed on the Devil May Cry that never was. Turning back the clocks to May 2004, we come to the beginning of our story. To add further context and set the scene, at this period we are in between the release of Devil May Cry 2 and Devil May Cry 3. It's also important to note that at this point in time, Sony have announced the PlayStation Portable, which is where our first piece of evidence comes into play. This is the earliest piece of evidence I could find that confirms that Devil May Cry was planned for the PlayStation Portable, and it's an article on IGN, the well-known, very popular games news outlet. The article states that Sony Computer Entertainment Japan has confirmed that Capcom is indeed working on a selection of PlayStation Portable games that just so happens to include the Devil May Cry series. This was news that wasn't included at their official E3 press event, which is why there wasn't all too much fanfare. Now that we've established that May 12th is the genesis for this game's life on the internet, let's skip forward 3 days to where we get another article from IGN, who just so happened to have a chance to sit down and interview Tsuyoshi Tanaka, one of the producers for DMC 2 and 3, and Yuji Shimomura, the action and cutscene director for DMC 3. Whilst the focus of this interview was on other upcoming Capcom titles such as Devil May Cry 3, IGN couldn't help but sneak in a question in regards to DMC PSP, but were given a standard PR answer of no comment. This is likely because at this point, even though Sony themselves had announced that a PSP game was in development from Capcom, Capcom themselves hadn't officially unveiled or announced the title. However, the article does round out by stressing that the no comment that they were given comes with a caveat that there was an implication that maybe the game had only just been greenlit, and that is perhaps why they were unable to comment. With the game announced and very little to go on, we fast forward a few months and focus our attention on the 11th of September 2004 when we gain some new insight on this title. The 11th marks the date on which IGN puts up an article discussing Capcom's announcement of their plans for Tokyo Game Show, which took place on the 24th of September 2004. Unsurprisingly, this was the game show in which Sony planned to announce a whole heap of information on the PlayStation Portable, from things like its price to its release date, to even the game titles that you'd be able to play on the console. Capcom confirmed that they'll indeed be at Tokyo Game Show, and that they wish to show off 3 new titles for the PSP. The first of which is a new Darkstalkers title, which we now know is Darkstalkers Chronicle, a supposed remake of a Dreamcast compilation of the Darkstalkers series, Beautiful Joe, which we now know is Beautiful Joe Red Hot Rumble, and of course, a Devil May Cry title, supposedly building off of the hit PlayStation 2 series, but at this point it is unknown as to whether or not this would be a port of a DMC game or if it would be a new DMC game entirely. Now, interestingly enough, as I've just mentioned, out of those 3 titles, 2 of them came to fruition, and, unsurprisingly, the Devil May Cry title didn't. But hey, all hope is not lost, right? Even if the game never reached completion, that TGS press event was well documented, so surely there should be an archived trailer or some footage of this PSP game, right? Well, unfortunately, we'd be wrong. All that Capcom had showed off at this press event in regards to Devil May Cry was an absolutely banging Devil May Cry 3 trailer, which, might I add, a young DNC absolutely lost his marbles at when he saw it featured on MTV, of all places. For our next piece of information on this game, we'll let time slip by all the way to January of 2005, a new year, With the PSP set to launch in March 2005, coincidentally, Devil May Cry 3 would also launch on the PS2 around the same period. The reason I'm mentioning this little piece of information is because in January 2005, Capcom decided to do a European PR tour for the upcoming Devil May Cry 3, which would launch at this point in just a few months. Included in the entourage that Capcom sent around Europe was the producer of DMC3, Tsuyoshi Tanaka, who of course was very well fitted for answering questions on everything Devil May Cry 3 and did a wonderful and enthusiastic job of showing this new title to budding game journalists, which is where we get our next sliver of information. In an article written by Joe France, a French gaming news outlet that was invited to the French leg of this European tour, they confirmed that they got a chance to sit down with Tsuyoshi Tanaka and ask him about Devil May Cry on the PSP, where they were able to confirm that it will not be a remake of any of the PS2 games and that it will likely be a completely original game. This next part might be a little lost in translation thanks to it being written in another language, but it does seem to state that Capcom mentioned it would be a new type of game altogether. In another article written in January by Metastation, a Spanish gaming news outlet, they were also able to corroborate that same piece of information in that it would not be a remake but a new game altogether when Capcom's PR tour reached its final leg in Spain. Now this next discovery is a little puzzling. On the exact same day that Metastation put out that initial article, on January the 13th, they put out another article stating that the game will indeed not be a remake, but it will also be based on Devil May Cry 3, which, at this point, is not out. I find it puzzling, quite frankly, because it could have easily been included in that initial article, but also because none of the other news outlets out there at this time corroborated this news. I couldn't find any other official source out there who likely would have been part of this tour who mentioned that it would be based on DMC3. After this point is when the trail starts to grow cold. Devil May Cry 3 has its time to shine in the spotlight when it releases in Japan in February and then in the rest of the world in March, but then the PSP game drops off the face of the earth. Months later in June 2005, we get our first teaser trailer of Devil May Cry 4 at E3. Then months later in September, we get another teaser of DMC4 at the Tokyo Game Show. And it seems at this point, all of Capcom's focus for the Devil May Cry series seems to have shifted over to DMC4. In the periods of 2006 to 2007, the internet was still rife with rumors as to what exactly has happened to the PSP game, considering there is radio silence. And in the gestation of these rumors is where the origin point of the Dance of Sparda name comes from. There was no official confirmation I could find whatsoever from Capcom or from any other gaming news outlet that was respectable that confirmed that the game would feature Sparda, would be focused on Sparda, or would even have the name or subtitle Dance of Sparda. It all seemed to be wishful thinking from a very dedicated fanbase, but who could blame them? After all, the DMC series was hitting its peak at this point with the release of DMC3. As time continues to elude our grasp, we find ourselves on the 31st of January 2008, where DMC4 releases internationally, and we continue to hear nothing about this supposed PSP game. But it's important to note that the game still wasn't officially cancelled at this point in time. I ended up confirming this myself by using the Wayback Machine Internet Archiver to take a look at Capcom's website and specifically their list of PSP games. I ended up getting a snapshot of what this site looked like in May 2008, where you can see here that Devil May Cry for the PSP was still a working title with no release date whatsoever. And it wasn't until April 15th, 2009, when DMC for the PSP finally felt the cold embrace of death, as it was essentially cancelled. A lot of gaming news outlets at this time took a look at their recent issue of Famitsu and realized that DMC for the PSP was no longer included in the upcoming release list. To further drive this point home, there was a special note included in the copy of Famitsu stating that the game was cancelled. Certain outlets such as Destructoid went one step further when writing their article by directly reaching out to Capcom, who were able to personally confirm that the title was indeed cancelled. This is where the video was initially supposed to end. After all, the enigma had been solved, the mystery completely dismantled. But then I ended up stumbling across another obscure and quite peculiar article dated August 2009, where the Chinese gaming outlet Duaowan published an article with a few potential leaks, shall we say, of a Devil May Cry game for the PSP. By looking at these screenshots, you can quite clearly see that it is based off of Devil May Cry 4, and with that in mind, I immediately thought of DMC4 Refrain, the mobile version of Devil May Cry 4. But as I continued to look closer at these screenshots, I realized they didn't look all too much like DMC4 Refrain at all. I knew that Refrain itself launched in 2011, so perhaps these screenshots are of some sort of prototype or beta version of Refrain before they finalized the design we eventually got. Unfortunately, this is the only site that I could find that covered this news, and if there are any others, they're lost to a time that even the Wayback Machine couldn't reach. And that brings us to the end of this video. I do want to give a quick shout out to fellow YouTuber Agnin Rudra, who I believe covered a similar topic in Spanish and kind of pushed me to do my own research as I didn't understand a word he was saying. Let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are on the Devil May Cry that never was, and if you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on what comes next. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.